Did anyone here understand a word I just said? The billionaire smiled as he asked the question, and the silence that followed was exactly what he wanted. It settled across the restaurant like a heavy curtain, swallowing the soft jazz drifting from the corner stage and muting the clink of crystal glasses against fine china. High above downtown Chicago, inside one of the city's most exclusive private dining clubs, nearly every seat at the long table was occupied by people who measured success in stock prices, acquisitions, and private jet hours. They laughed when Charles Whitmore laughed. They nodded when Charles spoke. And tonight, they were watching him play one of his favorite games. Charles leaned back in his chair and swirled a glass of sparkling water. At 46, he had built an investment empire that stretched across 3 continents. He collected companies the way some people collected watches. But there was something else he collected too. Reactions. He enjoyed putting people off balance. Enjoyed watching confidence disappear from faces. Especially when someone underestimated him first. Around the table sat venture capitalists, technology founders, hedge fund managers, and political donors. Most of them were smiling already. They knew what was coming. At the edge of the room, Naomi Ellis moved quietly between tables carrying a tray. 27 years old. Black. Professional. Calm. Invisible to most of the people dining there. Her dark uniform was perfectly pressed. Her silver name tag caught the light each time she passed beneath the chandeliers. She had spent the last hour refilling glasses, delivering appetizers, and making certain every detail of the evening ran smoothly. Few guests had looked directly at her. That was normal. In places like this, service staff were expected to appear and disappear like shadows. Charles noticed her approaching his table. A slow grin spread across his face. One of the investors seated beside him chuckled softly. Another lowered his eyes, already anticipating the outcome. Naomi stopped beside the table with her notepad ready. "Are you prepared to order, sir?" she asked. Charles looked up. Then, without warning, he spoke a sentence in a language so unfamiliar that several guests immediately exchanged confused glances. The sounds rolled through the air with unusual rhythms and sharp consonants. Nobody at the table understood it. Not even the international investors. A few guests laughed nervously. One man whispered, "What language is that?" Charles ignored the question. He repeated the sentence while looking directly at Naomi. The smile never left his face. Around the table, amusement spread. They assumed she would apologize. Ask him to repeat himself. Maybe call over a manager. That was the usual outcome. Charles enjoyed these moments because they reminded everyone who held the advantage. Naomi remained perfectly still. Her expression did not change. For several seconds, she simply looked at him. The room waited. The pianist in the corner continued playing softly. Glasses hovered halfway to lips. A server carrying a tray stopped walking. The anticipation became almost physical. Charles leaned forward slightly. "Well," he asked. More laughter followed. Then something unexpected happened. Naomi smiled. Not an embarrassed smile. Not a nervous smile. A knowing one. For the first time all evening, her eyes revealed something hidden beneath the professional calm she carried so effortlessly. Charles noticed immediately. The laughter around the table began to fade, because suddenly it felt as though the game was no longer unfolding the way he intended. And somewhere deep inside the room, a story nobody saw coming was about to begin. The smile remained on Naomi Ellis's face. That alone was enough to make the room uneasy. Charles Whitmore noticed it first. Most people reacted to his little language tests the same way. Confusion, embarrassment, apology, occasionally irritation. But never this. Never quiet confidence. Around the table, the laughter began to weaken. One investor lowered his glass. Another leaned forward in his chair. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly, like a compass needle moving toward a different direction. Naomi glanced down at her notepad and then back at Charles. For a moment, she said nothing. The pause stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Charles folded his hands together. "Problem?" he asked. Several guests smiled, expecting the inevitable surrender. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Not at all, sir." Her answer sounded perfectly normal, perfectly professional. Yet something in her tone caused a few people to stop smiling. Charles studied her more carefully now. The game was no longer proceeding according to its usual script. Naomi repeated several of the unfamiliar words he had spoken, her pronunciation precise enough that 2 guests immediately exchanged surprised looks. One of them happened to be a linguistics professor from Northwestern University. His eyebrows rose. Charles noticed that too. The professor slowly placed his fork down on the table. That reaction alone was unusual. The room became quieter. Naomi remained composed. Years earlier, she had learned something important about intelligence. Truly knowledgeable people rarely announced it. They carried it quietly, the same way musicians carried rhythm, the same way athletes carried balance. It became part of who they were. Across the restaurant, the pianist continued playing while city lights glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago stretched beyond the glass like a field of stars. Inside, nobody seemed interested in the skyline anymore. Every eye remained fixed on Naomi and Charles. One of the investors laughed awkwardly. What language was that anyway? Charles did not answer. He never answered that question immediately. Half the fun came from watching people guess incorrectly. Some assumed it was a European dialect. Others thought it came from a remote region in Asia. Tonight, however, Charles was no longer focused on the audience. He was focused on Naomi. She had not flinched, had not asked him to repeat himself, had not looked for help. Instead, she seemed almost amused. "You seem familiar with it," Charles said. Naomi's smile softened. "A little." Several guests chuckled. The professor did not. He was watching her very carefully now. Because if he was hearing what he thought he was hearing, this waitress had just pronounced several extremely difficult sounds with near-native precision. Charles leaned back. Curiosity slowly replaced arrogance. "Interesting." Naomi wrote something on her order pad. "Would you like the dish prepared traditionally, or would you prefer the modern version you requested?" Silence. Absolute silence. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody at the table understood why it mattered. Charles did. Because she had not merely understood his words. She had understood a cultural reference hidden inside the order itself. A reference that most fluent speakers would miss. For the first time that evening, Charles Whitmore stopped smiling. And for the first time, the people around him realized they might not be watching a waitress walk into a trap. They might be watching the trap close around someone else. The silence around the table stretched so long that even the pianist seemed to sense it. His music softened into the background while every person seated near Charles Whitmore waited for an explanation. Nobody received one. Charles simply stared at Naomi Ellis. The question she had asked moments earlier continued echoing in his mind. Traditional preparation or the modern version? It was not merely the correct response. It was the precise response. The kind of response only someone deeply familiar with the language and its culture could have given. Around the table, curiosity replaced amusement. One venture capitalist leaned toward the linguistics professor. What exactly just happened? The professor never took his eyes off Naomi. "If I am correct," he said quietly, "she understood something most fluent speakers would have missed." That answer only deepened the mystery. Naomi remained perfectly composed. She held her notepad patiently, waiting for Charles to finish his order. Her calmness unsettled him more than any argument could have. He had spent years building a reputation as the smartest person in most rooms. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, he was unsure. Charles finally cleared his throat. "Traditional," he replied. Naomi nodded. Then, in the same rare language, she responded with a sentence that flowed effortlessly from one word to the next. The sounds carried across the table with natural rhythm and confidence. The professor's eyes widened immediately. One guest nearly dropped his fork. Another looked around as if waiting for someone else to explain what was happening. Nobody could. Charles listened carefully. Not because he doubted her pronunciation, because he could not find a single mistake. When Naomi finished speaking, she gave a polite smile. "Excellent choice, sir." Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. The room remained frozen for several seconds after she left. Finally, one investor laughed nervously. "All right, somebody tell me what just happened." The linguistics professor leaned back in his chair. She did not just answer him. Everyone listened. She corrected a regional reference in his order and suggested the historically accurate preparation. More silence followed. This time it felt heavier. Charles looked toward the kitchen entrance where Naomi had disappeared. For the first time all evening, he was not thinking about the language itself. He was thinking about her. Who was she? How had she learned it? Why was she working as a waitress in a private dining club? Questions replaced confidence. Across the restaurant, Naomi stepped through the service doors and entered the kitchen. The noise changed immediately. Plates moved. Orders were called out. Chefs worked beneath bright lights. Unlike the dining room, nobody here cared about billionaires. Naomi placed the order ticket on the counter. One of the cooks noticed her expression. "Everything okay?" Naomi smiled. "Long night." The cook laughed. "That is every night." Yet even as she returned to work, Naomi knew something had shifted. Not because she wanted attention. She did not. But because people like Charles Whitmore were not accustomed to being surprised. Meanwhile, back in the dining room, Charles continued staring toward the kitchen. Around him, conversations slowly resumed. Investors discussed markets. Executives checked phones. Glasses clinked again. The evening appeared to return to normal. It did not. Because for the first time in years, Charles Whitmore had encountered a mystery he genuinely wanted to solve. And before the night ended, he would discover that Naomi Ellis knew far more than a single rare language. When Naomi returned to the dining room carrying the first course, she expected the evening to continue as if nothing had happened. Instead, she immediately felt the difference. Conversations paused when she passed. Heads turned. People who had ignored her an hour earlier now watched her with open curiosity. The attention made her uncomfortable. She preferred being invisible. Invisible people were free to observe. Visible people became part of the story. Charles Whitmore remained seated at the center of the long table, but his posture had changed. The confidence was still there. So was the authority. Yet something new had appeared alongside it. Interest. Genuine interest. Naomi placed the carefully prepared dish in front of him. The aroma of herbs and slow-cooked vegetables drifted upward beneath the warm dining room lights. Charles glanced at the plate, then at her. "You were not surprised?" he said. Naomi looked at him calmly. "By the order?" Charles nodded. "Most people are." Around the table, several guests pretended not to listen. None of them succeeded. Naomi folded her hands lightly behind her back. Languages stopped being surprising after a while. One investor laughed. After a while, he shook his head. "I spent 3 years trying to learn Spanish and still sound like a tourist." A few guests chuckled. Naomi smiled politely. "Learning any language takes time." The linguistics professor leaned forward. "How many do you speak?" The question instantly captured the entire table. Charles watched her closely. So did everyone else. Naomi hesitated. Not because she wanted to create suspense. Because she disliked discussing herself. "Enough to get into trouble," she said. More laughter followed. The professor smiled. "That is not a number." Naomi considered her answer. 6 fluently. A few others well enough to have conversations. Silence returned. One woman nearly dropped her wine glass. Another guest blinked twice as if he had misheard. Charles stared at her. 6. Naomi nodded. More or less. The room struggled to process the information. The waitress standing beside them had quietly revealed a skill that would impress diplomats, professors, and international executives. Yet she had delivered the statement with the same tone someone might use when discussing the weather. Charles found that detail impossible to ignore. People usually advertise their talents. Naomi seemed determined to hide hers. The first course continued. Servers moved through the room. The pianist shifted into a softer melody. Outside the towering windows, Chicago shimmered beneath thousands of city lights. Inside, however, the conversation had changed completely. Nobody wanted to discuss investments anymore. They wanted to understand Naomi. "Where did you learn?" asked the professor. Naomi looked toward the skyline. For a moment, something thoughtful crossed her face. "My grandfather." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Your grandfather taught 6 languages?" "Not exactly." A faint smile appeared. He was a translator. He believed every language opened a different window into the world. Several guests listened carefully. When other children watched cartoons, Naomi continued, "He sat me at a kitchen table with books and recordings." The table erupted with surprised laughter. Charles laughed too. Then he noticed something unexpected. He was enjoying the conversation. Not because he was controlling it. Because he was learning something. That realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. And as the evening continued, a growing suspicion formed in his mind. Naomi Ellis was hiding an even bigger story than anyone at the table had imagined. The mystery surrounding Naomi Ellis should have faded after that conversation. Instead, it grew larger with every passing minute. By the time the second course arrived, nobody at Charles Whitmore's table seemed interested in the food anymore. The chef had prepared a masterpiece of seasonal ingredients arranged with artistic precision, Yet most of the guests barely looked at their plates. Their attention remained fixed on the waitress, who had somehow transformed herself from background scenery into the most interesting person in the room. Naomi continued working as if nothing unusual had happened. She refilled glasses, collected empty dishes, checked on guests at neighboring tables. The normal rhythm of service never changed. That, more than anything, fascinated Charles. Most people enjoyed attention. Naomi appeared determined to escape it. Across the room, city lights shimmered beyond the enormous windows. Traffic flowed through downtown Chicago like rivers of red and white light. Inside the private club, however, the atmosphere had become strangely intimate. Conversations from nearby tables drifted through the air. Soft piano music lingered beneath the low murmur of expensive discussions. Yet at Charles's table, one question continued hanging in the air. Who exactly was Naomi Ellis? The linguistics professor finally asked what everyone else had been wondering. Did you study languages in college? Naomi paused while pouring sparkling water. No. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. The professor looked genuinely confused. Then where did you learn? Naomi smiled softly. Mostly at home. Charles leaned back in his chair. 6 languages at home. The question sounded less skeptical than curious. Naomi nodded. My grandfather believed language was a responsibility. The table fell quiet again. What does that mean? Asked one investor. Naomi considered the question carefully. He used to say that every language disappears one speaker at a time. If nobody learns it, eventually it is gone forever. The professor slowly nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. Around the table, others listened with growing interest. Naomi rarely talked about her grandfather. But tonight something about the conversation felt different. Perhaps because nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was trying to embarrass her. They were simply listening. Was the language he taught you tonight endangered? Asked the professor. Naomi looked surprised. Very. The professor smiled. I thought so. Several guests immediately turned toward him. You recognized it? One woman asked. The professor nodded. I recognized pieces of it. He glanced toward Naomi. Not many people would. That statement landed heavily. Charles felt something shift inside him. Earlier in the evening, he had used the language as a test. A clever trick. A way to entertain himself. Now he realized he had unknowingly stumbled into something far more meaningful. This was not a party trick for Naomi. It was part of her family's history, her identity, her respect for knowledge. A few moments later, another guest decided to test the story. He spoke a short phrase in French. Naomi answered immediately. A woman across the table responded in Italian. Naomi smiled and replied. The investor beside Charles tried German. Same result. Laughter filled the table again, but this time it sounded different. Not mocking. Amazed. For nearly 10 minutes, the dinner transformed into an impromptu language exchange. Each answer arrived naturally, effortlessly, as though Naomi were switching channels rather than changing languages. Charles watched the reactions around him. People who had spent fortunes on private schools and elite educations were sitting speechless because a waitress possessed a skill none of them expected. And somewhere in the middle of the laughter and surprise, Charles began to understand that the most remarkable thing about Naomi was not how much she knew. It was how little she cared about proving it. The evening should have returned to normal after that. Most unusual conversations fade quickly in places like this. Wealthy guests become distracted. New topics appear. Attention shifts elsewhere. Yet something about Naomi Ellis refused to fade. By the time dessert menus arrived, neighboring tables had begun noticing the strange energy surrounding Charles Whitmore's group. Several diners glanced over more than once. A few recognized Charles. Others simply sensed that something unusual was happening. The private dining club had hosted senators, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries over the years. Yet even among those stories, moments like this were rare. Naomi continued moving through the room with the same calm efficiency she had shown all evening. She cleared plates, refilled glasses, delivered coffee orders. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had become the most talked-about person in the restaurant. Charles found that increasingly fascinating. Most people revealed themselves the moment they received attention. Naomi seemed determined to remain exactly the same. Across the room, the pianist transitioned into a slower melody. The lights reflected softly against polished wood and crystal glassware. Outside, Chicago's skyline stretched into the distance beneath a clear night sky. The city looked endless. Inside, however, the world felt strangely small. Charles watched Naomi stop briefly beside another table where an elderly couple thanked her for recommending a dessert. She smiled, exchanged a few words, and continued on. There was nothing extraordinary about the interaction, yet it revealed something he had not noticed before. Naomi treated everyone the same way. Billionaires, professors, tourists, elderly couples. None of them seemed more important than the others. The realization unsettled him, because most people changed their behavior around power. Naomi did not. Back at the table, the linguistics professor stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "You know what surprises me most?" he said. Several guests looked up. "What?" asked an investor. The professor glanced toward Naomi. "Not that she speaks 6 languages." He paused. "It is that she never mentioned it." The table fell quiet again. Charles understood exactly what he meant. Most people spent years advertising accomplishments, degrees on walls, awards in offices, titles and email signatures. Naomi carried something extraordinary and treated it as ordinary. One guest laughed softly. Maybe she did not think anyone would care. The professor smiled. Or maybe she learned something the rest of us never did. Before anyone could ask what he meant, Naomi returned carrying fresh coffee. Charles looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi nodded. "Of course." Charles leaned forward slightly. "Why work here?" Several guests immediately became interested again. It was the question everyone wanted answered. Naomi poured coffee before responding. "Because it is my job." A few people laughed. Charles smiled. "You know that is not what I mean." Naomi considered him for a moment. Then she looked out toward the city lights beyond the windows. "Because life does not always follow the plan you make when you are 20. The answer was simple, honest, human. No dramatic speech followed. No tragic revelation. Just truth. Somehow that made it more powerful. Charles sat back in his chair. For years he had assumed talent and success traveled together. Tonight he was discovering how often the world ignored remarkable people simply because they wore the wrong uniform. And somewhere between the coffee, the conversation, and the glittering city outside, Charles Whitmore realized that the lesson he thought he was teaching had quietly become the lesson he was learning. The question lingered in the air long after Naomi walked away. Because life does not always follow the plan you make when you are 20. The simplicity of the answer made it impossible to ignore. Around the table, several guests stared into their coffee cups as if the words had touched something personal. Even among people accustomed to success, almost everyone carried a story about a dream that changed direction. Charles Whitmore certainly did. He looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the city below. 20 years earlier, he had imagined a life filled with achievement. He had achieved more than he ever expected. Yet somehow he felt less satisfied than he imagined he would. Across the room, Naomi continued serving guests with the same quiet professionalism she had shown all evening. The attention surrounding her had begun to spread beyond Charles's table. A neighboring group had apparently heard part of the conversation. Another table recognized her from the language exchange. Curious glances followed her as she moved through the dining room. Naomi noticed, but ignored them. There were still orders to deliver, still glasses to refill, still work to do. At one point, she stopped beside a table occupied by 2 international business executives visiting from Europe. One of them spoke briefly to her in Italian. Naomi answered politely and continued walking. The executive blinked in surprise and turned toward his colleague. A minute later, a guest near the bar tried speaking to her in Portuguese. The result was the same. By now, whispers were beginning to travel through the restaurant. "The waitress speaks everything." The phrase moved from table to table like a rumor gaining momentum. Back at Charles's table, the linguistics professor laughed quietly. "I think you accidentally created a phenomenon." Charles smiled despite himself. "I think she did that on her own." For the first time all evening, there was no trace of competition in his voice. Only admiration. A few minutes later, dessert arrived. Plates decorated with careful precision appeared beneath warm lighting. Yet the conversation continued drifting back to Naomi. Not because she demanded attention, because she represented something the guests rarely encountered. Authenticity. One investor finally asked the question everyone had avoided. "Do you think she realizes how extraordinary she is?" The professor considered the thought. Then he shook his head. "I think she knows exactly who she is." Silence followed. It was a different kind of silence than the one that had greeted Charles's language test earlier. That silence had been built on expectation. This one was built on reflection. Across the room, Naomi stopped briefly near the piano. The musician smiled and thanked her for bringing him coffee earlier. She smiled back. Nothing dramatic. Nothing impressive. Just kindness. Charles watched the exchange. The more he observed her, the more he understood something important. Naomi never changed depending on who stood in front of her. She treated professors the same way she treated musicians. Billionaires the same way she treated tourists. There was a consistency to her character that money could not purchase and status could not imitate. And somewhere between dessert and conversation, Charles realized that the rarest thing in the restaurant was not the language he had spoken. It was the person who had answered him. By 10 o'clock, the private dining club should have been winding down. Dessert plates had been cleared. Coffee cups sat half-empty beside folded napkins. Conversations drifted toward flights, meetings, and plans for the following morning. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. The reason moved quietly between tables carrying a silver tray. Naomi Ellis had become the center of gravity in a room that usually revolved around wealth. The irony was impossible to miss. She had not given a speech. She had not asked for attention. She had not tried to impress anyone. Yet somehow she had accomplished exactly that. Charles Whitmore remained seated near the windows overlooking Chicago's glittering skyline. Earlier in the evening, he had arrived expecting entertainment, expecting control, expecting to be the most interesting person in the room. Now he found himself watching Naomi the same way an investor studies a company nobody else noticed. Not because he wanted something from her, because he wanted to understand her. Across the dining room, several guests approached Naomi one at a time. One asked about a language she spoke. Another asked about her grandfather. A third asked whether she had ever considered teaching. Naomi answered politely but briefly. She never lingered. She never turned the attention into a performance. The more she avoided the spotlight, the brighter it seemed to become. Near the piano, the linguistics professor stood to leave. Before collecting his coat, he walked over to Naomi. The surrounding tables immediately grew quieter. I have spent 30 years studying languages, he said. Tonight, I learned something important. Naomi smiled. What is that? The professor adjusted his glasses. Knowledge and credentials are not the same thing. Several nearby guests nodded quietly. The professor extended his hand. Naomi shook it. Then he left. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Charles found himself thinking about it long after. Because the professor was right. The world often confused titles with wisdom, diplomas with intelligence, status with value. Tonight had exposed that mistake in front of an entire room. A few minutes later, Charles finally stood and walked across the restaurant. The movement immediately attracted attention. People noticed when billionaires changed direction. They noticed even more when billionaires approached waitresses. Naomi looked up as he arrived. Can I help you with something? She asked. Charles smiled. The question made him laugh internally. All evening people had been asking what he needed. Naomi was still treating him exactly like every other guest. Actually, he said, I wanted to thank you. Naomi blinked. For what? Charles glanced around the room. For reminding me of something. The city lights reflected behind him through the glass. What is that? She asked. Charles thought about the answer carefully. Then he spoke. That intelligence does not announce itself. The words settled gently between them. Naomi looked away for a moment. Not because she was embarrassed. Because she did not quite know what to do with praise. My grandfather used to say something similar, she replied. What did he say? Naomi smiled. The smartest person in the room is usually too busy learning to prove they are smart. Charles laughed. A real laugh this time. Not the practiced kind used in boardrooms and interviews. Around them, the restaurant continued moving toward closing time. Yet for one brief moment, neither seemed aware of anything beyond the conversation. And as the night drew closer to its end, Charles Whitmore realized he had come to dinner believing he was testing someone else. Instead, the evening had quietly tested him. By the time the last guests began leaving, the private dining club had grown quieter than Naomi Ellis had ever seen it. The pianist played one final melody before closing the lid of the grand piano. Servers collected empty glasses. Chairs slid gently across polished floors. Beyond the towering windows, Chicago glittered beneath a blanket of lights stretching toward the horizon. The city looked unchanged. Yet for many people inside the restaurant, something important had shifted. Earlier that evening, Charles Whitmore had arrived expecting certainty. He believed he understood how the world worked. People with influence held attention. People with knowledge displayed it. People with extraordinary abilities rarely spent their nights carrying trays between tables. Then he met Naomi, and every assumption he carried into the room quietly fell apart. Near the service station, Naomi folded a linen napkin and placed it into a collection bin. The night was finally ending. She felt tired in the familiar way that follows a long shift. Yet she also felt relieved. The spotlight that had followed her throughout the evening was fading. Soon she would take the train home, make tea, and return to a life that looked nothing like the one sitting at Charles Whitmore's table. That thought made her smile. Across the room, Charles collected his coat and prepared to leave. Several guests stopped to shake his hand before departing. Others thanked him for dinner. Yet the conversation he remembered most involved neither investments nor business opportunities. It involved a waitress and a language spoken by almost nobody in the room. Before walking toward the exit, he crossed the dining room one final time. Naomi noticed him approaching. "Good evening, sir," she said. Charles shook his head lightly. "After tonight, I think we can retire the sir." Naomi laughed. "That might confuse the management." Charles smiled. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card. He looked at it for a second before placing it back inside. The gesture surprised even him. Normally, he offered cards to anyone who impressed him. Investors, executives, consultants. Tonight felt different. Naomi noticed the movement, but said nothing. Finally, Charles spoke. "You know, all evening people have been asking how you learned those languages." Naomi nodded. "They have." Charles looked toward the city lights beyond the glass. "I think they were asking the wrong question." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What should they have asked?" Charles smiled. "Why you never felt the need to tell anyone." The answer arrived almost immediately. "Because knowledge is not a performance." The words settled between them. Simple, honest, unforgettable. Charles laughed softly. Then he extended his hand. Naomi shook it. Not as a waitress greeting a customer. Not as a billionaire acknowledging an employee. Just two people recognizing something valuable in one another. Around them, the restaurant continued closing for the night. Staff members finished their work. Lights dimmed gradually. The city beyond the windows carried on. Yet the lesson remained. Charles had spoken a rare language hoping to impress a room and embarrass a stranger. Instead, he discovered someone who understood far more than words. Someone who carried intelligence without arrogance. Skill without vanity. Knowledge without the need for applause. Long after the evening ended, guests would forget the menu. They would forget the wine selection. They would forget the business conversations. But they would remember the moment a waitress answered a language nobody expected her to know and quietly reminded an entire room that brilliance does not announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits to be seen.